Hello, everyone. All right. Can everybody hear me okay? Judy, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. All right. So it is 12:01, so we're going to go ahead and get started. There might be a few people that are going to join us as we go along, but I'm aware that this is lunch break for some people, so let's get started. So thanks all for joining. My name is Nicole Schill from the Park District, and I was inspired to make this presentation today because this week is the National Invasive Species Awareness Week. So here at the Nature Center and throughout the Medina County Park District, invasive plants and invasive species are something that we deal with on a daily basis, and just wanted to spread a little bit more awareness. So our presentation today will be in 3 parts. The beginning will be very approachable for anyone. So if you are not familiar with invasive species, we're going to go over with some definitions first. Then we'll talk a little bit about why we care. And then at the end, I'm just going to very briefly go over just some different invasive species. So we definitely will not talk about all of them today that are occurring in Ohio. And we can't really go in depth to the long-term care of removing those species, but I'll just give us kind of an overview, where they come from, why are they a problem, things like that. So the way I'd like to do this presentation is if we could all keep our mics muted, but let's use that chat feature. So if you have questions as we go along, go ahead and type those in. At the end of each of those 3 sections, I'll stop and review the chat, try to answer some questions. And then at the very end of the presentation, if anybody would like to stay on, we can have some conversations at the end. So if you'd like to talk, that would be a great time to do so at the end there. So, all right. So let's start at the very beginning with our definitions, is what is native? So when we talk about a native species versus a non-native or invasive species, what does that mean? So native plants and animals occur in an area and they rely on each other for survival. So they've been in this area long enough that the plants and animals have evolved together and developed very complex and essential relationships. So there's lots of different definitions out there for what exactly is native. And my favorite is from The Living Landscape by Rick Dark and Doug Tallamy. So it's that last bullet point there. And I think they really capture what it means to be native and why that is important. So these animals and plants have created together complex and essential relationships. So what does that mean? So a very good example of animals and plants relying on each other in an environment to be successful and having very, very specific roles in these complex relationships is the milkweed plant and the monarch butterfly. So I think a lot of us have heard of this relationship. The monarch butterfly relies on the milkweed for its survival. So the black and orange coloring on the monarch is a warning to predators that, hey, I'm toxic. And they get that toxicity from when they are a caterpillar. They eat the milkweed and they absorb the toxins from that milkweed, and that toxin and then protects them their whole lives. This is a really common, monarch butterflies are talked about a lot. Their milkweed as their host plant is talked about a little bit, but there's lots of other insects that have complex and essential relationships with this plant as well that I think maybe some of us have never heard of before. So there's the milkweed tussock moth, right? It's developed the use of those toxins in the same way. We have the milkweed beetle. There's the milkweed swamp beetle. The swamp milkweed beetle and the milkweed bug. So these are all specialists on these plants. So without them, without those plants, if their habitat is endangered, if we see these invasives moving in and crowding them out, these insects will not survive. They absolutely rely on them. In return, the plant itself is going to get pollinated, right? It has these big flowers attracting them and other pollinators to them. But this is just one example of a very, very complex and essential relationship that these animals and plants have. And it was able to be created over a long period of time. So when we think of native, they generally cut it off as like, before the pioneer, as we were founding the United States here. So some different benefits of those natives are, especially in plants, is that once they're established, they generally require less water and maintenance. They have natural controls in the environment, which we'll continue to talk about. So that means that there are other plants, there's insects, there's herbivores that can control these species and keep them from overwhelming. And then that last bullet point there, they provide a wide range of resources. So we'll see as we continue to go forth that some of our animals and plants are not all created equal, especially if they aren't native and haven't had time to develop these really great, complex and essential relationships. So that makes us go to non-native. So like I said, around 1750 is the generally agreed upon cutoff for native and non-native species. So non-native species did not evolve here, but that doesn't make them invasive. So they are from another area, we've brought them here, and they aren't overwhelming, okay? So the Douglas fir is a good example of a tree that has been brought to this area. It can provide shade and some habitat, but maybe not as, doesn't fulfill a role as well as a native tree would. So some of our animals and plants might not know what to do with it. But not all of them are invasive. Some of the things we need to be careful of with non-natives, though, is they can introduce and harbor diseases. And then because they are now being moved from a habitat where they grow naturally, with the right amount of water, soil, sunlight, they are disease resistant. We're bringing them here to Ohio, where maybe it's a completely different environment. And now we have to work as caretakers, we have to work really, really hard to make this animal or plant flourish. So one example where this didn't go so great for us is that the chestnut blight. So it was the Japanese chestnut was introduced in the 1900s, and it brought with it a fungus, a disease that's been spread by wind. So through that, we brought a species of tree that is not invasive. The tree's not going to take over. It kind of found its place in the environment, but it brought with it a fungus that then killed 4 billion trees. And chestnut trees are harder than ever to find. So our native populations were pretty much wiped out. All right, so there's some positives and negatives to non-natives. So when we bring these species here, the wildlife sometimes doesn't know what to do with them. So either it's a cultivar or it's a completely different species that these animals are looking at, these animals and insects, and are like, I have no idea what to do with this. So if you look at our little cartoon here, this bee is looking at a flower and it doesn't know where to go in to get the resources that it needs. Sometimes, though, we introduce these non-native species on purpose because animals don't know what to do with it. So a lot of times not always, but our deer resistant and some of our other ones are non-native species because the deer, again, they didn't evolve with it. They're looking at this species for the first time and saying, I don't know what to do with this. Is this edible? And they might just pass it over. But we all know deer like to just take a little sample anyways, especially if it's in our garden. All right, so then that brings us to invasive. So the USDA defines invasive as an alien species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So I'd like to point out that the USDA is most worried about humans twice and our environment only one time. So that is a pretty good clue when we start talking about invasives and how certain ones got onto the list And then after you've looked at invasives for a while and there's a few species that aren't on the list, you're like, hey, you know, I've seen burning bush grow in the forest. It's escaped from our houses and things like that. Why didn't it make on the list? Well, a clue could be that it's not causing economic harm yet. So what makes a plant an invasive and not just a non-native? So invasive plants have very aggressive growth and reproduction. So they move into an area, and when they can't find a natural pressure to control them, then they're just going to keep multiplying and keep multiplying, and then eventually it's going to become a problem. So fast growth, rapid reproduction, and very high dispersal rates. All right, so cattail stand is our little example here. I'm sure when you've been driving around, you've seen that they crowd out. They become so thick that they're hard to see through. So different drivers and pressures and things like that are going to lead to something becoming invasive. So in order for it to become invasive, it has to get here. And there's lots of different ways it can get here, and almost every single one of those is humans. So all of our invasives have been moved around the world on accident, just moving things through shipping. On occasions, things have been moved in the pet trade, and then people have released them and it become a problem. Or simply we didn't realize that it was going to become a problem. So they start putting pressures on the native species, which are already trying to compete with each other. And now there's this new competition that comes in who doesn't have to basically answer to the same pressures. So it doesn't necessarily have a predator or a disease or something that's going to keep those numbers in check. And then after that, we have to figure out what are we going to do with them. So we're watching how the communities and the populations respond to these non-natives. And then once they become a problem, us humans then have to respond to that. All right, so only about 10%, there's a 10% rule. About 10% of the exotics or non-natives that are brought here are going to live at all, right? So if you bring something from the southern hemisphere into Northeast Ohio, it's going to have a tough time living just through one season, let alone establishing. All right, and then only 10% of those that do live will actually become invasive, right? So it's actually a pretty small number of non-natives that are going to become invasive. So they have to get here, live long enough, and then also be that tiny little 10% that is going to become a problem species. All right. So that's a great place to stop. If you have any questions, I'll go ahead and pop those in the chat before we move on to our next section. Okay, I don't see any questions, so everybody's still with me. Love it. Okay, so why do we care? If we're bringing these animals in, why on these plants, why is it a problem? Why do we care? So it all comes down to the environment, ecosystem, and food chain. So especially way down at the bottom, we have plants. And plants then are going to be the very foundation of our ecosystems. And it works its way all the way up, right? So we have the caterpillar that eats a plant, and then the chickadee eats the caterpillar. We also have these ecosystems that are under the ground, right? Very complex and essential relationships going on under there as well. Soil stabilization, we have all our decomposition going on down here, okay? So why do we care? Because humans are part of the ecosystem. We're all the way at the top of the food chain. So it stands to reason that if we're up here at the top and we're looking down the line, if those bottom levels go, we're in trouble, right? So everything's relying on everything else. So some of these animals and plants have very complex and essential relationships. And I'd like to argue that we have very complex and essential relationships with our ecosystems as well. So they are going to provide irreplaceable ecosystem services. Everything that goes on outside, we just need to kind of shift our mentality that we are part of this ecosystem and not separate from it and watching it. That food chain is going to be very important for our food chain and what we get. Some of the other ecosystem services that are provided that are irreplaceable, that we are not able to replicate by any human means, are things like decomposition. So turning dead things, dead organic matter into soil. Doing any sort of water control, wetland mitigation, prevention of flooding, something that, again, as humans, we can do an okay job trying to replicate with our technology, but our wetlands and things like that are going to do a far better job with a lot less cost and expenses. All right. We also have pollination, where all of our food's going to come from. Again, this is something that they're trying to design drones to do. We're trying to see if we can get different machinery to get out there and try to learn how to pollinate. While we have all of these creatures around us that are doing it for free and doing it much, much better than we can. All right, and then lastly, there's just a really important component to realize. There's been lots of studies out there that nature makes people happy. So having street trees around has proven to reduce stress and to increase home values. So protecting our ecosystem and all of those services that they provide for us is very, very important. So again, just trying to get our shift into thinking about humans are part of the ecosystem. So this is an entire section where I feel like that I could spend a lot of time on trying to get us all on the same page and really thinking about it. And I think that's something that is going to be an ongoing, kind of a lifelong education to everybody, just to try to get them on board and everybody to come together and realize that all of those services that we have out there are worth protecting. Okay. So again, this is a good place to stop to see if anybody else would like to ask any questions in the chat before we move forward. All right. Very good. So the rest of our presentation is, again, just a little bit of an overview of some of the different invasive species that are in Ohio. And we won't be able to talk about every single one of them today. This is a little bit of an overview about, this is the official list of Ohio invasive plants. So this is, written into legislation. There's laws preventing and prohibiting the trade, transfer, selling of any of these species. This is our aquatic species. There's a couple different species of fish on here. We got some plants. And then these are our insects that are causing us problems on there. And there's probably a few on there that you'll recognize and that we're going to go over. So just as a disclaimer, when we talk about the different controls and treatments of these things, it's very important that you check with your local authorities for different permits that are required, especially when it comes to aquatic invasives. There's a lot of laws and rules around that. And anytime you're using any sort of herbicide or pesticide, please read and obey those labels. All right. So first up, we have the Asian longhorn beetle. So we do have native longhorn beetles that look very similar. So it'll take a little bit of time to kind of like master that ID, but those blue markings on the horns and the blue markings there on the legs there are a pretty good indicator. You can see on the photos there about how their size is, and they have nice round holes when they come out. So they're native to China and the Korean Peninsula, and they were first discovered in 1966. So the Asian longhorn beetle isn't talked about quite as much as it used to be because there's been a number of successful quarantines and have kind of been able to successfully eradicate it from a few states like Illinois and New Jersey. So this one can definitely be a problem because it will go inside of ash trees, birch, elm, buckeye, sycamore, maples, willows. There's a huge range of trees that these will infest. And if you, I don't know if you remember, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, a lot of these don't move firewood. It bugs me. Bumper stickers were very common. You'd see signs all over the place. And I remember as a kid actually seeing these and not understanding what it meant or why. Like, and that didn't really look into it any farther. And then these were repurposed again to be used for the emerald ash borer in more recent years, which I'll go over next. So the Asian longhorn beetle has a metamorphic life cycle like all beetles do, and every single part of that life cycle, so egg, larva, pupa, adult, they can all survive within firewood, living tree or dead tree. So that's why the number one way to control this species from spreading is to limit the amount of firewood and things like that are being moved around. So that's what the whole part of that education was about. So never deterring people from continuing to go camping and having campfires and things like that, but not moving the wood around from across county lines and things like that, so that way it could stay. So those quarantines were actually successful in a couple of states, and it's been completely eradicated. There's a very small population still in Ohio. So this one is particularly destructive when it's a larva. So it's a wood-boring beetle. It goes into the bark of the wood and then starts eating the living parts of the tree underneath the bark. So it can destroy a tree from 10 to 15 years, and usually you don't see the majority of the damage until it's too late. So after 3 or 4 years, you'll start seeing the holes, and you start seeing the reduced health of the tree. And then by then, there's really nothing you could do. Very similar in the story is the emerald ash borer. So I don't think there are probably too many people here who haven't been affected by this. Would you agree? Most of us are at least semi-aware of the emerald ash borer as our street trees have been coming down. Trees on our yards have caused lots of damage to homeowners as they come down. So this beetle is native to China, Mongolia, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Russia. So it's now here in the United States, and it has affected 35 states from East Coast to West Coast. It's first discovered in 2002, and there were a series of quarantines trying to block or slow down the spread of these, and it was unsuccessful. So the quarantines have actually been lifted because it's continuing to move around, and it was not working, wasn't slowing it down like everybody had hoped it would. So it arrived here in wood packaging materials that was used to ship goods, so it was a complete accident. And they're actually very beautiful beetles, right? That bright green. And there are other native boring beetles, but this is the only one that if its wings are spread, the top of its abdomen is going to be bright red, and then when the outer wings, the elytra, are that nice, beautiful emerald green that they're talking about. So very similar story to the Asian longhorn beetle. Again, it was transported around from firewood, from lumber, anything like that, any sort of wood that was moved around. And people just didn't know, right? They're very small and they're hard to see. Right now, the current the current line of studies is kind of going towards investigating using biological control for these, the emerald ash borer. So they're looking at 4 species of stingless parasitoid wasps. So very, very, very small wasps that would attack and kill the emerald ash borer larva. So I've seen rudimentary applications of this available. So you can contact your local authorities and the USDA and find more information on that. And it's more for, I believe, like, you know, commercial woodlot growers and things like that. You could request some more information on those things and see about getting treatments. They've tried different sort of pesticide treatments, and it's extremely expensive. And because of how, again, prolific these borers are, how prolific the beetles are, it seems like the cost of doing a pesticide treatment just completely is out of the question. You know, you're pouring lots and lots of money in it, and you might be able to save a single tree, but it's not anything that's going to be a long-term, and it's not going to prevent it. So pretty much like all of our invasives that we're going to talk about today, prevention is going to be key. The damage that I think a lot of us have felt, we talked about how there's street trees. They were, you know, ash is a very fast growing tree. So a lot of different municipalities have lost those. And ash trees are very fragile once they die. They have really large limbs that will come down. So those are dangerous to property owners. And it's been valued at billions of dollars worth of damage. I know in our parks, you can start to see the forest habitat change. We have a lot thinner stands of trees, and that's led to more wind damage. So some of our healthier trees that are standing are falling. And then it's just generally reduced habitat for all of our wildlife. So next we have 2 types of mussels. And I think this one's pretty interesting because I don't think a lot of us you think about mussels in general, like just on a daily basis. You know, when you think about all of the different wildlife out there that we're supporting, I don't think mussels usually makes the list. So on this slide, the most important part of the picture to look at is the little diagram here that shows the size of zebra and quagga mussels there on the bottom right compared to the size of our native mussels. So there's a huge size difference. So we'll talk about both of these. The quagga mussel was discovered in the Lake Erie in 1989. That's this one here on the bottom. And they are usually found in water that is deeper, so 100 feet or deeper, and they can tolerate cooler water temperatures. It's native to Ukraine. Zebra mussels was discovered in 1988 in Michigan, and its native range is Eurasia, but they're rarely found below 50 feet. And they get their name from their kind of striped zebra pattern. So quagga mussels are going to go a lot deeper, and then our zebra mussels are going to be in the more shallow water. So quagga mussels have, and zebra mussels have a life cycle where a female mussel will lay eggs, and then those eggs develop into free-swimming veligers. And right here we have a picture of a veliger. So they're microscopic, they're very, very tiny. And for the quagga mussels, they can produce up to 1 million eggs, right? So it's completely external fertilization. And then these eggs, these little, will develop into the veligers, and the veligers will then, you know, swim around, spread out, go find a new place to live. And the adults can live out of water for 5 days, which is, again, a problem, because they are often transported by accident through bait buckets and things like that. They become a problem because they are filter feeders. So they're extremely effective filter feeders, which on its own wouldn't be a bad thing, but they can consume and reproduce so much that they will eat all of the plankton and all the other very, very small, you know, algae. and there won't be any left for the native species. They have an avoidance for the blue-green algae, right? That's the microcystis algae that causes problems in things like Chippewa Lake and Lake Erie. And so without that other algae competing with the blue-green algae, we have even higher concentrations of blue-green algae. So this can then lead to actually having toxic water. We saw how small those little tiny mussels were, and they start to accumulate and can crowd out natives and also clog up intake pipes and other different pipes that are in the water, and it can be a huge problem to go down there and try to clean and get those out of there and keep everything running smoothly. So something that all of us can do is to continue prevention from spreading from one body of water to another. So it's very important that when we go kayaking or boating, even just wading around, and fishing upstream, make sure that we're cleaning all of our equipment at the end. So they can live out of the water for up to 5 days if they're an adult, which is a lot. So we have to inspect our equipment and make sure that we either dry dock for those 5 days. You can wash your boats and equipment in 140 degrees water or more. And then there's not really another good control. So we haven't figured out an effective way to treat these once they become a large scale problem. It's usually just basically treating the symptoms. Okay, that pipe's clogged again, got to go unclog the pipe. But there isn't really a good control for large scale infestations. So chemical control can be feasible in small isolated lakes, but again, those are usually very costly and not an option for larger areas or municipalities. Zebra mussels is almost the same story, very, very similar. They can only produce 30,000 to 40,000 eggs, right? So that's a little bit less than 1 million, but still very prolific. So they can survive even longer out of water, up to 7 days. And again, they are often transported in bait buckets and aquarium trades. Their damage is similar, but a little bit different. They do all the same things where they consume plankton and they crowd out. One of the other things that they do, since they live in shallower water, is they are actively competing with and outcompeting our native mussels. So they are small enough that when they're floating around, they can land on a mussel, a native mussel, and then choose to live there and become an adult, a heart with their shell and everything, on top of the native mussel, and they will accumulate there, and it makes it impossible for then the native mussels to open and close and feed, and will be completely smothered basically. And then the control is going to be the same. So they're also going to have to, it's all about prevention, just keeping them from going from one body of water to another. All right, moving forward into some plants. So the water milfoil is kind of a feathery looking plant when it's in the water. Sometimes we talk about seaweed. Well, this is pondweed, right? It's native to Europe, Asia, North Africa, and it has affected most of the eastern and central US. So it was first documented around the 1940s, and it was probably brought here between the 1800s and 1940. There's not actually a good credit of when this was first found. But it's very, very fragile, the plant itself. So just trying to pull on it, it'll break, but it'll grow very, very densely. You can see that pickup truck there full of Eurasian water milfoil. So as those pieces break off, they can actually sprout from a broken piece. So you have to be very careful when removing it. They grow by rhizomes, so underneath the water and underneath the pond floor, there is a large network of rhizomes, which is basically like big roots where all of these different plants are connected. So, and it just keeps growing outwards and then growing upwards to reach that sunlight. So they do produce seeds, but that's not considered their main mode of dispersal. They're mostly, a piece will just break off and wash downstream, and then it can establish an enormous colony in a new place that it lands. So this is a problem because those dense mats then block out sunlight, which then reduces the other plants that can live there. It reduces the amount of plankton and algae that are growing, and it can completely clog and remove different habitat for fish and for swimming, for people, for recreation. So I think all of us, or most of us, have probably gone fishing and been very, very frustrated when you throw your line in and it gets snagged on a plant. So this, if it grows dense enough, is going to make it impossible, right? So recreation is actually a big industry that can be impacted by something like this. As far as control, so how do we take care of it? Prevention's always number one. I'll just keep saying it. But you can also remove it by its roots, which sounds like an enormous task. We saw that pickup truck that's back there. I can't imagine the amount of work that took to get that out of there. Chemicals can be viable, but again, these are usually non-specific chemicals, so not always an option depending on where we are. And then lastly, I thought this one was, again, very fascinating. So biological control, like just we talked about with the wasps earlier, is always fascinating to me because a lot of times we have to go to an animal or plant's native home and bring another non-native in order to take care of it and hope that that one isn't also going to become invasive. So for this one, the milfoil weevil, which I think are just adorable little insects. So I have a picture on there. They look like tiny little elephants with little snoots. So they feed on the plant and they grow on the stems. And this one in particular does not eat any other type of plant, and they will only attack the Eurasian water milfoil. They don't completely annihilate it, but they do reduce its vigor and can make it into a more manageable amount of water milfoil. All right. So moving forward, we also have Hydrailla. This is another one that looks very similar and has similar growth habitats. And you can imagine what multiple aggressive species in one water habitat can do to that habitat. It'll make it into something that doesn't even recognize what it used to look like. So this one was first discovered in the 1960s and was introduced through aquarium trade. So it grows in kind of dim lights, and it was a great plant for fish tanks, right? Made sense. But then it escaped, you know, either a piece of it was flushed down the toilet, you know, somebody released a fish, who knows, but the rest is history. So this one also produces seeds, but it's not considered its main mode of dispersal. Very similar last one, a piece can break off and a new one can grow. It can completely shade out the other natives that are in there. It changes water chemistry. It reduces and swings, different oxygen levels in the water. It lowers the amount of diversity of fish. And then again, all of those problems that we talked about with the industry and recreation. So clogging drains, making it impossible to fish and boat. So especially for this one, mechanical removal, so physically pulling it out is not recommended because even the smallest plant fragment can grow into another plant and it can become an entire colony. So this is another one of those interesting cases with biological control. So grass carp, so non-native grass carp, will eat and effectively remove Hydrailla, but they're not specific herbivores. They're not like that weevil, which is the weevil's only going to go for the milfoil. Grass carp will pretty much eat anything that's in there. So I'd be really interested to see how that's been effective for some areas. All right, everybody still with me on here? No new questions? All right, so Phragmites. This is a massive plant. Again, another one that you can see driving around pretty much anywhere, you know, driving on the highway, they grow in ditches, anything that has sort of wet soil, they can pop up. So interesting enough with the Phragmites is there's actually a native species. So if you look in this top left here, on the left side, there is a very slender seed head of the native Phragmites. And you can see there's just a couple seeds on there. On the right, there is a very large plume of seeds, very thick and full of thousands of seeds. That is the non-native strains that were introduced from Europe. So this has been affected all across the United States. All lower 848 states have Phragmites, and they will literally grow anywhere. And it's a very large problem for wetlands and wetland species. So this was introduced possibly through ships' ballast water, which happens to be a way that a lot of our aquatics make their way here, as they accidentally come through on the ballast water. And I believe in more recent years, you know, in the last several decades, there has been increased regulation on ballast water to kind of try to prevent that. So these are huge plants, right? They can get, I've seen them so enormously huge. Like, there's a nice picture here of this lady's Loverhead, you know, 15 feet tall. And they create walls of impassable terrain, both for wildlife and for humans. They just grow very, very dense monocultures. So a monoculture would be all one plant in one area, too much of one thing, right? And it provides almost no food for wildlife. It's too thick of a habitat for nesting birds, restricts tidal flow. Any place that was a lot of animals, especially like birds and things, require both shelter and open water, and it eliminates that open water habitat because it's just so thick. It just will fill in any space that it can. They have enormous rhizomes under the ground. So that's kind of what we talked about earlier, all those roots that are connected. And it makes it very, very challenging to eliminate, right? So digging it up out of the ground piece by piece becomes an impossible task. So again, prevention, always number one. When you visit an area, make sure you clean your watercraft. They recommend dry docking before going to the next area. There have been pretty okay successful management by continuing to mow it over and over again. So this is possible in some of our drier locations, but as you can imagine, in a wetland or an area that's very, very wet, that's just not an option. So then that leaves us with chemical control. Phragmites, if you've ever been curious what those big flags are when you're driving around, now you know. All right, garlic mustard. So now we're going to get into some more of the herbaceous land plants. And garlic mustard is one that I see a lot of my volunteers are visiting today. So I see a lot of you are probably already familiar with this one. So garlic mustard is native to Europe, and it was brought here for herbal and medicinal purposes. So it was first recorded in 1868, right, for food. And it grew well here, and so well that it became a problem, became an invasive species. So it can be 2 to 4 feet tall. If you see that picture in the bottom left there, it grows very thick stands, has all those nice white flowers on top, so at least it makes it easy to identify. And it's challenging because it's a biennial. So the first year when it grows, it has just very small kidney-shaped leaves that come up. And then the second year is when it'll produce the 2 to 4 foot plant with a stalk on it. So that biennial life cycle makes it a little challenging to remove because you have to do you have 2 different growth forms now that we're attacking that you have to be aware of and that you have to go after in order to control it. So each plant can make up to 4,000 seeds. which is a lot of seeds, and then they remain viable in the soil for up to 6 years. They can take over a forest floor habitat. So they will prefer full sun, but they will grow just fine in partial to full shade. And particularly in our parks and anywhere else that has very, very good native spring wildflowers, this is something that we want to be aware of and protect, because those spring wildflowers are living in a very, again, essential and complex relationship where those spring wildflowers are trying to pop up right before the trees put their leaves on. They're going to grow, they're going to take all that sunlight, and then their life cycle is usually done, right? They're done doing their flowers when the leaves start putting, the trees start putting the leaves on the tree. So this garlic mustard is interrupting that. They grow very quickly, they grow faster than our native plants, they grow taller, they shade them out, and they actually produce chemicals that they put into the soil to try to stop other plants from growing. They literally will be able to cut off other plants from these nutrients and things like that through their chemicals. They're also contributing to the decline of the West Virginia white butterfly. That butterfly has a complex and essential relationship with Dentaria. So there's 2 species of wildflower that it relies on to put its eggs on. And if it gets confused or can't find any, sometimes it'll put their eggs on garlic mustard instead. And they have had studies come out that have the butterfly has reduced success to even make it to an adult. So the chemicals that are in that plant are harming the caterpillar, and they usually don't make it to adulthood. So again, prevention, always key when you're walking around if you go into the forest, make sure that you empty your cuffs of your pants and your shoes and things like that. If you have any mud, make sure you remove the mud out of your boots, so that way any seeds that are stuck in there don't get taken to the next place. So at the park district, we manually remove this every spring. And if you are interested, we have lots of opportunities on the calendar. So you pull the entire plant from its root. There's been some other different ways that you can kind of try to manage it. Like there's studies right now, and there's a new one that I'm very interested in when it comes out, where they are experimenting with cutting just the flowers before they go to seed. So there's some downsides to that, is that this plant is incredibly resilient. So if you leave the flower behind, it'll continue to develop into seeds. So you have to make sure that you remove every single one of those. In large areas where it's a problem, chemical application can definitely be an option. And then, interesting enough, they're studying 4 different weevils to see if those could be possibilities for biological control. All right, see, we got about 10 minutes left, and I think we're going to be perfect on timing. So this is the Asian bush honeysuckle. There are multiple species, and they're native to China, Russia, Korea, and Japan, and they're all across the United States. They were first introduced in 1752 and then reduced again in the 1800s, and thought to be very beautiful ornamental plants, and then used as soil and erosion control. Again, this is another one of those plants that is probably growing all around you. You try to drive by it all the time. It's on the highways, any of those big open fields. It's taken over. It really is not that picky with its habitat. So it was thought to be a beautiful ornamental because of those really nice berries that they have there. And then the flowers, the honeysuckle smell is very pleasant. So the farm that I grew up on, when I think of honeysuckle, that's what I think of as my family's farm, driving in, rolling the windows down, and then just a massive amount of invasive honeysuckles, just wafting into it. It smells great. I understand absolutely why we thought this was a great idea. Let's bring this here. But it is avoided by most herbivores. Nothing really seems to eat it or deter it from growing. The biggest problem is it produces lots and lots of fruit, and the birds like that fruit, so then they take it off and carry it around, and anywhere they deposit those seeds can be a new plant. So it's made its way all across the United States. They are very, very dense when they grow in stands. They'll grow right next to each other, and then they'll grow so densely that, again, we're talking about that forest floor that we're trying to protect. There will literally not be another plant growing under it. It'll just be soil. There have been studies that have shown cardinals love to eat Asian bush honeysuckle berries, but they don't provide very much nutrition. They're really, really high in sugar and low in fat, and birds, especially migratory birds, need fat in order to survive. And they're showing that these cardinals are having overall lower fitness, even though they like it. So they're kind of like little tasty treats that they just can't say no to, which I can kind of relate. So prevention, these are on the list of official species that you cannot buy, sell, or trade. If you have one of these or several of these around on your land and property, cutting them down and then putting on a herbicide afterwards is going to be the most effective way to remove those. And if you like the look of the Asian bush honeysuckle but would like to plant a native instead, I got one right here for you on the screen. Winterberry holly. It's a beautiful tree, and it produces those really, really nice red berries. Oh, Multiflora Rose. This is again one of those like roadside species that you see all the time, native to Japan, Korea, and China. It was introduced in 1866 as a rootstock for ornamental roses. So it's a nice, healthy rose, and they would use that as the base and then graft on other ornamental roses. Later in the 1900s, it was planted and promoted as a living fence. And I'm positive that that living fence was effective because it grows very tall, wide, it just keeps spreading, and then it has these thick, recurved thorns on there. So we have lots of native roses, and they have thorns as well, and they look kind of similar, but those big recurved thorns are going to be one of the biggest indicators, or one of the fastest field indicators that you're like, this is what I'm looking at. This is Multiflora Rose. So they grow pretty much anywhere. They can produce 1 million seeds. The birds will also pick up and distribute the fruit that way as well. And then there's not another herbivore that's going to go after and be able to eat those, the actual thorny parts, right? Because it's covered in thorns. So they crowds out all of our other native shrubs. So this one is aggressive enough that I've actually seen multiple times it growing up and over trees, up and over shrubs, and using them as a support system for this massive rose bush. So not a fun one to take care of at all. It's hard to get in there. So stopping it when they're young and small, like at the first sight of seeing them, is definitely going to be the best method. But after that, mowing repeatedly can help reduce the growth and the spread. In big open areas, we do prescribed burns, and that can help keep it under control. But a foliar spray is going to be the best application method. Unfortunately, after it dies and everything is back, you still are left with the massive plant and all of its thorns to then either leave to decompose, or you have to figure out a way to remove it. And I did that for a couple summers, and it was not very fun. So there's a bunch of different biological controls that have been looked at, but they are unfortunately not so very selective. So again, there's concerns about, is this going to be a problem for our native roses or some of our cultivars, especially the ones that we've spent lots of time and money, especially if we think about our grandparents' generations, making these wonderful cultivated roses, and we don't want to accidentally introduce a biological control that's going to damage those. Okay, so this is our last species of invasives of Ohio. This is the Calorie Pair. And this, I believe, is just kind of an interesting story when you think about humans. Okay, so this was introduced to Maryland as a sterile plant. It was a tree that was going to It was just the Frankenstein monster, winner of it all. It's got all the things that you want and none of the things you don't want. It can tolerate salt. It's a great street tree. It has these big, beautiful flowers that come out in spring. And guess what? It's sterile, so we're not going to have to worry about it. Turns out we were wrong. And it was able to cross-pollinate with lots of other non-sterile calorie pairs and produce seed. So now we have a huge problem with calorie pair. It's also known as Cleveland pear or Bradford pear. This is a photo of an empty lot, and I'm seeing more and more of these, especially places that have been, marked for land development, for putting houses and things in, but haven't actually started the process yet. So many calorie pairs, and they will just become a giant monoculture, just a stand of just one species of calorie pair. And I don't know if any of you have noticed, but they stink. Their flowers smell like hot garbage. They smell so bad. So I don't really see the appeal as a street tree from that from that standpoint, but they were supposed to be very tolerant of lots of different habitats and be fantastic, for municipality trees. And it turns out they did such a good job that we can't get rid of them. So they do produce thorns, and they will become become very, very large, dense trees where they just can't, we can't get rid of them. So there's lots of different alternatives to the calorie pair. If you have one, I beg you, please consider removing them and planting something else like a serviceberry or a crabapple, which is going to produce beautiful white flowers in the springtime, and then also going to provide lots of food for wildlife. So the calorie pair does produce viable seeds, and you can see on this picture they have very, very small hard fruits, and the animals don't care for them really. So they don't really provide a lot of habitat that way. They also have very weak branches. So as far as being in your yards and being on the streets, they weren't as good as the promises that were made. All right, so I just have a couple slides left, and I wanted to show you one species that was in the United States that was taken to a different country and is a huge problem. Because I think it's very easy for us to start getting down this rabbit hole of invasives and these things from Ohio and start looking at there's lots of things from Europe and Asia, and they're bringing it here. It goes both ways. This is the gray tree squirrel, the same gray tree squirrel that is in our backyards and all around our parks. And it is a massive problem in the UK. This was released in 1876 and is an invasive there with not really any good control method. So they are a lot bigger than the red squirrel that lives there, the native red squirrel. If the food is available, they can have 2 litters of young per year compared to the red squirrel that just has 1. And they have brought with them a disease. There's this parapox virus, which the gray squirrel appears to be completely immune to, but the red squirrel that's there in the UK is, they're dying to it. They're not immune to it like our gray squirrel is. So there's not really a good method for them to take care of them over there. Basically, the approach is to try to create as much red squirrel habitat and red squirrel boxes that the larger gray squirrel can't get into. But they really haven't come up with a better control method than that. So some of the things that I wanted you to go home with. Native species have complex and essential relationships. Talked about that. The invasive species are a problem because they disrupt those essential relationships we talked about in those irreplaceable ecosystem services. All of us are part of the ecosystem. It behooves every single one of us to pay attention to what's going on outside and in our yards, our property, our land that we have, to contribute and try to be good land stewards and make it as welcoming to wildlife and those services as possible. And then prevention is key. That preventing those invasives is always going to be easier than trying to take care of the problem afterwards. Unfortunately, a lot of our control methods for these invasives is a reaction to something that's already a problem. So to continue education, keep learning. There's so much more to learn out there. There's a lot of invasives that we didn't talk about today. Some things that you can do there, though, are, especially with plants, is research before you plant. Spend a lot of time looking at what do you have and what are you going to be putting in your yard. Choosing natives. Cleaning your equipment when you go through to different sites, whether that's public land or just visiting a friend that also has a forest. You can donate. You can vote with your money. You can make an impact by donating to different organizations that are educating about this, that are preventing this, that are managing. And then we can also vote out for the legislation and the use of our tax dollars to be going to those things. So I borrowed this theme from SlidesGo, so I want to make sure that they got credit. And I wanted to leave up here while I took some questions. There are some additional resources on the screen for you. And then I know some of us probably have to scoot. There's my email address and there's my office number. So if you guys have any questions, absolutely please call, email, and you can find more information on our social media platforms and on our website. So I will take some questions if anyone has any. Feel free to unmute and we can have a conversation. If you have something you want to drop in the chat, we can talk about. But I really appreciate all of you taking the time out of your day to be here. So thank you.